Hey everyone, it's Kong again, back with a long overdue update on the Freekong account. And as it would turn out, there's actually a very good reason that this update is as long overdue as it is. I had been planning for a while to create a video like this in advance of Freekong picking up the 999-day login bonus character bag thing. So this is going to be that kind of video, but something came along that threw a wrench into those plans. So you'll probably recall that earlier Freekong's faction freebies video that I put out when they first introduced those new faction buffer intro maps. And as a result of that video, I actually ended up choosing Ultimuller for this account. Now, the 999-day bag includes a different pool of characters to select from, a larger pool. In the similar vein of that video, I am going to go through all of them and kind of evaluate their strengths and weaknesses as they relate to Freekong's barracks. I ended up getting the 999-day bag actually quite a while ago on this account, and I just ended up sitting on it for a while, leaving it in my inventory, partly because I was a little bit too lazy to fully put this video together at the time. But then, it ended up being kind of a good thing that I delayed that long because we got new news that in China, they're getting another freebies bag that includes basically all of the faction buffing characters from Langrisser 1 to 5. So, Ledin, Elwyn, Dehart, Jugler, Leon, Bernhardt, Bozel, Luna, Shelfaniel, Ultimuller, Lanford, Sigma, Landius, and Gizarov. Now that changes things a little bit, right? Because if I just have the 999-day bag, the choice is fairly obviously Tiaris, like who helps Freekong the most for the most content, reactive healing, attack blessing, that kind of thing. She's basically the full package, the main thing that the account is missing. There were also a lot of other characters who were kind of excluded on the basis of not having access to their bonds. But now, knowing that I'm going to be able to choose a character from this bag and from another bag, it opens up the possibility of choosing someone who's bond locked and choosing their bond unlocker. So as I started putting together a more in-depth spreadsheet that would take those things into account, what do we get this week but a Lunar New Year, Year of the Dragon, Faction Buffer Bag Part 2. It's the same 6 characters that we got in that initial Faction Buffer Bag. But that means Freekong is essentially sitting on 3 opportunities to take new, powerful SSR units. I did sort the characters according to how many of my little intro criteria they meet. I'm going to be talking about bonds. It makes no sense for me to take Omega, for example, if I'm not able to get his attack bond. Then I'm going to talk about the characters that Freekong already has access to that these characters fully unlock the potential of. So I'm not just getting a new character, but I'm also getting more out of my existing characters. I'll also weigh whether the new character has an SP class or access to an SP class, whether they have access to a faction buff, and whether that faction buff is for a brand new faction that I don't have a buff for yet. There are a few of those. I'll also be kind of briefly considering whether this new character will help me with any of the high-level PvE stuff like Ancient Beckoning, and then an overall summary of what my net roster boost would be if I were to pick that character. So, as I already hinted in this introduction, the number 1 choice so far was Tiaris. Do I have access to her bonds? Yes. I'd be able to fully unlock her right away. She would also bring additional value because she would finally unlock my Dehart's attack bond. Dehart without an attack bond kinda sucks. Dehart with his attack bond unlocked is essentially another whole new SP character that I'm allowed to use. She also unlocks Gerald and Layla's defensive bond, which would fully complete their bonds as well, although they don't really need their defensive bond too much. She is very commonly used in multiple Ancient Beckoning maps, so the net roster boost for picking Tiaris would be a Dehart, a Gerald and Layla, and a Tiaris, fully complete. Next in this top tier category is Luna. I do have access to all of Luna's bonds, so she would be able to be fully unlocked. She also unlocks the attack bond for Lewin. Again, similar situation as Dehart. He's a great character, but his full attack potential is not realized without Luna. She does bring a new faction buff for my account. I don't have a princess faction buffer right now. I do manage to cover all of her other princesses with other faction buffs, for example, Origins of Light, thanks to Freya. But having access to a whole new faction buffer does mean I can shift my teams around a little bit, which is useful for something like Ragnarok of the Realms. Luna is also useful in Jormungandr, Nidhogg, and Sleipnir, so I would be able to put up a better score on those fights. Next on the list in the top tier is Juglar. I do have access to all of Juglar's bonds. He would also unlock Pierre's attack bond, which probably isn't necessarily that important for the Freekong account. He also unlocks Sophia's defensive bond. He does not have a new faction buff, but he does have an Origins of Light faction buff, so it's just another option. The thing is, Freya's faction buff is in her main guarding 3C, so she's always going to be using it if she's in the team. Juglar does get used in Fenrir and Jormungandr, so he is interesting and important for PvE. One of the things about Juglar, kind of similar to Tiaris, is that he has unique mechanics. His ability to reactively heal the team when he gets hit by an AoE, that's something I don't have access to yet. Now the final person I've put in my top tier, and this one was truly a surprise to me when I put this spreadsheet together, and that's Sigma. So let's look at Sigma's strengths. You can see he has green all the way across the board here. I do have access to all of Sigma's bonds. He unlocks the defensive bond for Alfred, which is something, but it's not very important. The thing is, I would have access to Sigma's SP class. He also brings a new faction buff of Yelis. Again, I have these characters covered by other buffers, but if I wanted to run them in a separate Yelis team, he would help out Lisa, Shibaraku, Van, and the upcoming Agito Makishima. The next category is a little asterisk tier, and that's because this is a special consideration of characters who aren't top tier on their own, but become top tier when you consider that I have access to multiple boxes. First up is Elwyn. Now you can see the problem with Elwyn is that I do not have access to his attack bond unlocker, and Elwyn without an attack bond is disappointing. But he does bring value to the team. He would unlock Mac's attack bond, not just his attack bond, but because that's the first bond I'd be able to get for Mac, it also opens his heart bond. He would also open Hein's defensive bond, and I say yes times 2 here in the SP column because I would have access to Elwyn's SP class, but Elwyn coming to the team also opens up Hein's SP class. Hein is one of those early SPs that needs other units to do maps with him. Elwyn's one of those units and I never had Elwyn, so I just have a half-completed SP Hein. He does bring a faction buff for Legion of Glory. Now this one is not in orange like Juglar to denote a completely redundant faction buff, because my glory buffer is Grenier, and Grenier's faction buff has 2 problems. It's an SR faction buff, so it doesn't have a special effect, it just has the stats. It also means Grenier has to bring the faction buff, which he often doesn't want to do. So Elwyn's buff isn't necessarily new, but it is still helpful. I have a net roster boost here of Hein and Mac, but I also have some asterisks here on Elwyn and Liana, and the reason for that is because my next character in this tier is Liana. I think you can see where I'm going with this. If I'm going to take Elwyn from one of these bags, I would also have to take Liana from the other bag. That basically erases the negatives in this first column, because I would have the attack bond for Elwyn, and I would have the int bond for Liana if I chose both of those characters. Liana also unlocks the attack bond for Scott. She doesn't do anything else really other than being used in Hugin and Munin and having an OP kit on her own, so I would get access to Act Again, which is great. Now, the thing to remember is, I'm not going to want to take a character that enables another character, but then is left gimped on their own. Perfect example, the next character on this list, Bernhardt. Bernhardt, I would have no defensive bond for him because I don't have Leon. So of course, yes, the next most logical thing to think of is why not pick Leon as well? The problem with that is that Leon needs Elwyn. So if I bring Leon just to enable my Bernhardt, then I'm leaving a kind of a crappy low attack Leon on the table, which isn't necessarily the greatest benefit. If I wanted to be able to make that combo work, I would have to also pick Elwyn, which of course another domino falls. He doesn't have an attack bond unless I pick Liana. And if I want that to work, I need 4 bags, which I don't have access to right now. The positives, though, he unlocks the attack bonds for Vargas and Imelda. Vargas doesn't necessarily need his attack bond, but it helps with Imelda. He does have access to an SP class. He does have access to a better Empire's Honor faction buff than the one I'm currently getting from Lance. As we already mentioned, Leon would be missing his attack bond thanks to Elwyn. He would fully unlock the potential of Laird and Roga, their attack bonds. He does have an SP class, he does have a faction buff, he does get used in Sleipnir. Now I say here that I would have no attack bond for Ledin, which is not in orange, it's only in yellow because Ledin doesn't super need his attack bond. He's also a character that I could pick as part of a triple threat. I could take Ledin from the faction buffer box, Elwyn from the Chinese buffer box in 5 months, and Lyanna from the 999 day box. That would cover all of their bonds. But is that something I really want to do? Let's think about that. Ledin would fully unlock the attack bonds for Grenier, Narm, and Chris. Grenier doesn't really matter too much, Chris doesn't get used too much, but attack bond for Narm would be good. Ledin also has access to his SP class. He brings a Legion of Glory faction buff, which, as I just mentioned under the Elwyn section, would be beneficial, even though I already have one on Grenier. Next up, we have Listel. She doesn't have access to her attack bond because I don't have Landius. Even if I pick Landius here, I would need Landius' attack bond, which is Rachel. The thing is, Listel doesn't really need her attack bond, so that's something to think about. She doesn't unlock anyone else's bonds though, she doesn't have an SP class or a faction buff. She could get used in Fenrir, which I already have an S rank on, and she's really just a net roster boost of herself. I've prioritized her a bit lower here for that, smaller overall account impact. And on that note, we also have access to Landius in all 3 boxes. As I mentioned, he would have no attack bond, and if I were to pick Rachel just to unlock his attack bond, one of her bonds is Angelina, I believe, and then we couldn't also take Angelina because Angelina needs Shelfaniel, and it goes all the way down the line like that. Bottom line is, Landius with no attack bond is mega sad. He doesn't unlock anyone else's bonds either. He currently has no SP class, although I think he's kinda high on the list to get one in the future, even though he's really good right now. He does bring a new Yellis Legends faction buff, as I mentioned, with Sigma. That would help me buffing Lisa, Shibaraku, Van, and Agito. Okay, on to the next section here, which is the tier that I've labeled as bad tier, and that by no means that these characters are bad, so please don't interpret it that way. It's basically just a way of delineating how much they bring to the account if I were to pick them. And at the top of the bad list is one of my favorite characters, Lana. It's sad that she's down here, but I would have access to none of her bonds. Even if I only picked one of those characters, like for example if I picked Elwyn and Lyanna, I would leave one of Lana's bonds unlocked, or locked. She does unlock the attack bond for Sonya, which is nice. She does have access to an SP class. She has no faction buff. She could come to Fenrir and Needhog. She's overall a net roster boost of just Sonya. Next up we have Betty, who's an interesting character for this tier because I actually would have access to both of her bonds. She doesn't unlock bonds for anyone else though. She has no SP class. She has no faction buff. She's a net roster boost of just herself. She doesn't really bring anything to the team other than a fully unlocked character that I probably wouldn't use. Okay, next on the list we have Shelfaniel, and this is another one of those interesting combo choices for her to be this low. For bonds, I would have no access to her int bond unless I were also to take Angelina from the other bag. Now this is something that's actually possible because Angelina exists and her only missing bond would be Shelfaniel, so these two characters are reciprocal bonds. If I picked both of them, I could have them both fully unlocked. Shelfaniel unlocks Serena's attack bond and Oliver's attack bond. This doesn't fully unlock Serena because she also needs to get her defense bond somewhere else. Shelfaniel also has no SP class, but she does have a Princess faction buff, which as I mentioned earlier would be helpful for Cherie, Hein, Lifany, and Narm, but on her own, she only is a net roster boost of Oliver. We'll compare the Shelfaniel and Angelina combo with the Elwyn and Lyanna combo once we get down to Angelina. She's a little bit further down this list. Okay, next up we have Wheeler. I would have no access to Wheeler's int bond because I would need to also get Lanford, and I can't really combo him because to unlock Lanford, I would need Shelfaniel and Landius. Too many bags. Wheeler does unlock Serena's defensive bond and thereby her heart bond, but Wheeler has no SP class, overall doesn't really bring too much to the team. If we're just considering him purely as an SSR healer, then as a one-off pick, remember we could also one-off pick Tiaris if that was our main concern, or Lyanna in combination with Elwyn. Now at the bottom of the bad tier we have Gizaroth. Gizaroth unlocks no bonds. I have no bonds for Gizaroth. He has no SP class, but he does have a unique faction buff. He's my only access to a Mythical Realm faction buffer. In fact, one of Freekong's funnier problems is that when Forbidden Battlegrounds roll around, I literally can't even do a Mythical Realm feat because I only have 4 Mythical Realm characters. So I can't beat any of those maps with a quote full team of Mythical Realm characters. So Gizaroff would bring a buff for the likes of Almeida and Bozel, and he would be a net roster boost of no one. And finally we have Lanford. Again, I would have no bonds for Lanford unless I were to also pick Shelfaniel and Landius, and to make those picks worth it, I would have to pick Angelina and Rachel as well. The only interesting thing to note here on Lanford in terms of bonds is that he does unlock Rosenseal's defensive bond, and Rosenseal is going to be an option in the upcoming 1500 day pack. In that pack you get to pick any character from Act 1 or Act 2 of the Langrisser Mobile original characters. Now, picking Lanford here for that purpose would be the only way to unlock Rosenseal's Heart Bond, because her other bond unlocker is Clotaire, and since there's only one of those bags, I would have no way to get a free Clotaire. So if I were to pick Rosenseal, she would be completely bondless, and that makes me wonder if Rosenseal's even worth, or even the best person to pick from that bag now. Wouldn't someone like Tiaris just be overall better since I have access to her bonds? Especially now that we have SP Almeida to kind of be anti-debuff-ish. I know they don't do exactly the same thing, but for Freekong we really have to kind of stretch to make these characters fill each other's roles. Anyway, Lanford does theoretically have access to an upcoming SP class, since he was one of the 2 teased at the beginning of the year alongside Almeida. He also brings a Strategic Master's faction buff, which is not unique for me. I do have that buff already from Ultimuller. And he does get used in Needhog and Sleipnir. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these trash tier characters individually, so I'll just scroll them all up on the screen at the same time and go through them really quickly, since the number of things that they bring to the team is very tiny relative to the things that they don't. Other than Angelina, who, as we mentioned earlier, in combination with Shelfaniel would actually be possible to open both of their bonds. Angelina also unlocks the attack bond for Melania, but that's the only other thing she does. So, if we want to compare twofer combos between Angelina and Shelfaniel, Elwyn and Liana, what do we get, basically? We would get a fully unlocked super AoE mage in Shelfaniel, who can also bring a Princess Alliance faction buff, which is something unique for me. But Angelina, even a fully unlocked Angelina, would be largely benched. She doesn't make a huge splash. Whereas on the Elwyn and Liana side, we would be getting an SSR healer who can cast Act Again, which is a unique mechanic that I don't have, as well as a very strong SP DPS class, who brings a useful faction buff, and also unlocks Hein's SP class. So that's kind of like getting 3 characters for the price of 2. I think it dramatically outweighs the value of just Shelfaniel. Also in this tier we have Claret, who unlocks the attack bond for Alfred and can get used in Ancient Beckoning against Jormungandr, but doesn't really do anything else, and I don't have her bonds. Rachel, who would really just be used to unlock Landius's bond and then be benched. Brenda, who is really good in Ancient Beckoning, but I have no way to unlock her bonds. Rainforce, Lambda, Virash, and Omega are all characters who don't bring anything to the team at all. They don't unlock anyone else's bonds. Omega without an attack bond, I don't know if that's the greatest idea. So this all brings us back to the big decision. My options seem like they're either to go all in with that Elwyn and Liana combo, and then pick a third character, like Bernhardt would be a fine pick to run him without a bond as just a third character. Ledin actually combos with them really well, although I don't like the idea of bringing Ledin in because I'm super happy with Grenier as my tank for this account. In fact, using Grenier on this account has kind of made me think that he's probably, overall, if you overinvest in him like Freekong had to, he's probably the best PvE tank. So the other option, if I'm not going with one of these combos, is just to pick 3 units who all stand on their own really well and bring me some kind of new or unique thing. And that brings us back to this original short list of top tier characters: Tiaris, Luna, Juglar, and Sigma. A combo like Tiaris and Luna, or Tiaris and Sigma, or Tiaris and Juglar, is very similar to the combo of Elwyn and Liana. That gets me a great SSR healer, and a good DPS who gets used for a lot of stuff and brings me a faction buff. So this brings me to the dilemma, and I'm going to open things up to you. I'm going to figure out a way to run a poll in Concord, in This Old Neon's Discord, so if people are on there and they want to come cast a vote, they can cast a vote. I'll also put a poll in my community section here, so you can go to the community page, which I think is just like YouTube/Langrisser, and then click on community. But you can also chime in the comments below this video. And I'll be reading and responding to all of those and kind of collating the data and finding out what people think is the most popular and OP combo of 3 characters for me to choose. Feel free to recommend your own combinations and your own justifications as well. Looking at just the green names, the ones that I can pick from the Chinese New Year bag, the only one that really stands out as still being useful with all of those combinations is Bernhardt. Alright, that's going to be it for this video. The purpose of this was really just to give you a full rundown of all the multitude of options that Freekong has available, the ways that each of these characters can help the account, and kind of my thought process as I'm trying to figure out what's becoming a more and more complicated choice as time goes on and more free bags get thrown at us. Suffice it to say, no matter who we end up choosing, it's going to end up being a huge boost for the Freekong account. Let's have an account tour stream sometime. Not sure when that'll be, but I'll see you then. Happy Langrissing, everyone.